Thank you to all of you coming this evening, in spite of the fact it's about my book, so appreciate that. So I found over the years, particularly when I was actively involved in politics, that people would come because they were true believers, not because I was involved. So thank you very much. It means a lot to me. The person to thank for this is actually my wife, and whom I affectionately and respectfully call Lady Nelson. And and that's a story in itself, which is in the book. But it was she. I'd gone down to Corowa early last year to deliver the Tim Fisher oration, and we were driving back to Sydney listening to podcasts, and she started on about writing a book, and she said, "You've got to get this down before you forget it, and you've got to leave something for the kids." So I thought, okay. So I spent 3 weeks just going through letters, emails, photographs and newspaper cuttings, which I had over the years just put into boxes thinking they were of some value, and as I also did my job, by the way. And I thought at the end of February last year, I thought, well, if I do 500 words a day, I'll be finished by December. By July, I'd finished, and then I took 50,000 words out of it because it was too long, and it's still too long. I really did enjoy it, and it's extraordinary the things that come back to you as you're going through this process, if you've ever done it yourself or if you ever do. And it's about me, but it's not about me. It's actually about the people and the causes to which I've committed myself throughout my life. In the preface, I make the point that I have only been able to do what I have done in my public life as a result of, firstly, the medical profession, and secondly, the Australian taxpayers. And in all conscience, I can't profit from that. So all of the royalties go to Lifeline and Legacy, two of the... Thank you. Thanks, Dave. So 2 of the 9 charities with which I have a very close association. I'm patron of one and one senior ambassador for the other. And I also make the point in my preface that the Liberal Party and the members of the Liberal Party gave me life, and until the day of my death I will proudly be a member of the Liberal Party, but I will not be offering gratuitous public advice to those who represent it at any contemporary time. So, in terms of, Nick just summarised my career, and it's interesting, at the end of the preface I reflect on the Lifeline annual gala ball last year, and 2 young doctors, one an obstetrician, the other a pathologist, asked me, how did you go from practising medicine in the suburbs of Hobart to being the president of Boeing? And I said, here's the answer, you'll get it soon. And it's very conceited. You feel sort of conceited talking about your own life, but I often say to young people, you don't realise what you're learning when you're learning it. And often the most significant ideas and thoughts that most challenge, change and transform your thinking and outlook come in random moments of quiet revelation. When you least expect to learn anything, and often from the most unexpected sources. And the power is in the story. And one of the paradoxes that I've learned through my life is that even though there's an entire industry dedicated to the purpose, I don't think leadership can be taught, but it can be learned. And it's learned through observation of, reflection upon, and absorption of the leadership qualities and experiences that we see in others. As Nick says, I was born in Coburg, but I grew up in Launceston in northern Tasmania, and in the 13th year of my life, my father used to go away to sea. He was a Marine Chief Steward, a very committed Labor Party person and unionist. My mother was a devout Irish Catholic. Her mother's maiden name was Molly Maguire, one of 8 children, and my father's family were all Orange Lodge Methodists, so I understand the families didn't even talk to each other at the wedding in 1957. So that was where we grew up, and my father took me for a walk down the street in which we lived. And he said to me, "Son, have a look at the houses," which seemed like an odd thing because I'd seen them a million times before. And he said, "Look, your mother and I don't have any money. We don't know any powerful people." He said, "The only way you're ever going to live in a better house than the one in which you're living and the houses in this street is if you work as hard as you can at school." And at the time I had no idea what he was talking about, and you expected a lot of weird stuff in those days because a couple of months earlier I'd had the facts of life in a boat fishing on the Tamar River. You know, you had nowhere to go. So, so anyway, a few months later they sold that house in Cornwall Crescent in Newnham in Launceston, and they sold it because they wanted to move to a city where there was a university in case one of their 3 children had an opportunity to go. And Hobart then was a very expensive city, as it's now become again, actually. And so they moved to Adelaide, and my father had grown up in Adelaide, and he then experienced almost 2 years of unemployment with a major downturn in the shipping industry, which had been delivered by the Whitlam government, paradoxically. And so we had left Catholic schools. I was with Christian Brothers, and so I went to Modbury High School in Adelaide, which was a good school, but I felt I was missing something. And so then at the beginning of what is now year 11, I went to my father and I said, "Could I possibly go back to a Catholic school?" And so, as I say, as a very committed non-Catholic, but having immense admiration for the Catholic priests, he went 3 times to St Ignatius College in Adelaide to persuade the Jesuits to take me. And that's what saved me and set me up for life. I learned 4 things from the Jesuits, which I've sought to frame for my life and which I seek to impart to others and young people in particular, and Nick referred to them in his introductory remarks. They said that a life of success and value would be built on 4 things. The first is commitment. You have to consistently apply yourself to whatever it is in which you believe and subsume yourself completely into it, that you don't give up. John Howard, of course, on many occasions through his political career and public life, could easily and understandably have given up, but he didn't. The second, they said, is conscience, that every single decision you make has a fundamental question under it. What is the right thing to do? And they said further to that there are no such thing as big or small decisions. Every decision you make has consequences for you and for others. And I often say to young people, you see it all the time. I see it at Boeing, by the way. You'll see people who spend an inordinate amount of time focused on a particular decision. This one is really important, and then they're dismissive of or trivialising other decisions. And inevitably, and always, they get into trouble. The third, they said, is compassion, and which literally means to share another person's pain. And by way of digression, Neville Bonner, when he stood before the members of the Liberal Party in Queensland seeking preference to go to Canberra as a Queensland senator, the first Aboriginal person ever to do so, he said in part to the pre-selectors that in my experience of this world, there are 2 things of which we're in greater need: human compassion and understanding. Compassion has a literal Christian or moral sort of value to share another person's pain. But in leadership, it also has another very important purpose. So knowing what a person thinks is important. But what's far more important is understanding how a person thinks. Once you have the imaginative capacity to see the world through the eyes of another person, to understand how he or she forms his or her worldview, who and what is shaping them, that is when you're more than halfway there to working out how to challenge and change them. The 4th thing, they said, is courage. Nothing of value in life is achieved without taking a risk. And courage is hard to define. You know it when you see it, when you feel it. But it's essentially a spirit that challenges doubt in us. It's like when you're a kid and you're up on the high diving board with one of the other kids and you're looking down, fearful about and doubtful whether you should jump off. And it challenges that doubt. It imposes will, it protects integrity, it advances values, and ultimately inspires us to break through fear. I surprised everybody, including myself, by doing very well at school with the Jesuits, academically as well. I actually failed Year 11, narrowly. So I dropped all the physics and chemistry and the stuff I didn't like, and I did European history and Latin and English and economics and biology and so on. So initially I did an economics degree at Adelaide University, and then after 6 months or so I thought, this is not for me. I dropped out. My parents were devastated, as you can imagine. I then spent a year working in Harris Scarfe in a department store. I worked in the basement of Harris Scarfe in Adelaide. I sold doors and curtain fittings. And I worked with 3 very elderly women. They must have been at least 40. And, but I learned a great deal from them. And weekends working at the Clovercrest Tavern, character building, especially in the front bar on a Saturday afternoon. And I was thinking about what to do with my life. I knew I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life working in a department store. And it seemed to me that the people who end their lives with the greatest sense of satisfaction, in some way, have spent it in the service of other human beings. So there were 3 things that I settled on. One was the priesthood, Jesuit priesthood, but I'd acquired a taste for certain activities that were proscribed, so I had to rule that out. I then contemplated joining the police force, and then, quite by accident, as I document in the book, quite by accident, I discovered that Flinders University in Adelaide had established a medical school and would take you into the medical program if you hadn't done all that heavy science stuff in Year 12, as long as you had excelled. And then as your punishment, you'd have to do Physics 1 and Chemistry 1 at university. So I was successful in getting into medicine. I always intended, when I graduated, that I would spend my life practicing medicine. And I went to Hobart for a year, did a diploma of obstetrics and anaesthetics, and then went into trained to be a specialist paediatrician. But after a period of time of doing that, I thought, no, this is not for me. I'm going to see a dozen illnesses all the time. It's going to drive me crazy. So I went out of that, and I established 2 after-hours medical emergency services in Tasmania, one in Hobart, one in Launceston, with David Crean, Simon Crean's brother. Wonderful man, wonderful family, I can tell you. And so in 1987, I was angry with 2 organisations. I was angry with the federal government, and that, by the way, was the first year that I voted for the Liberal Party. I voted for John Howard. And I was angry with the Australian Medical Association. So I decided that I'd get active in the AMA, and I actually said, when I became the national president of the AMA at my first national conference, I said AMA should stand for Against Most Anything, because as a group of doctors and medical professionals, we'd spend our lives researching and seeking to understand the causes, prevention and treatment of disease, but when it came to public policy, we opposed absolutely everything and then steadfastly defended every inevitable change against the next thing that was coming down the line. But I was on a reform agenda with the AMA, and I'd been to 3 meetings, and I sat at the end of the back of the room, and I turned to the fellow next to me, and at this stage, by the way, I had a number 2 haircut. I had hair then, and I cut it all off. Now I haven't got any, and I'm trying to grow it. But I had an earring. I didn't own a suit. I had a questionable political background for someone trying to get active in a conservative organisation. But I said to the fellow next to me, if the last thing I do, I'm going to get wherever I have to get and to do whatever I can to change this organisation. And my friend said to me, oh, you're mad, you'll never get anywhere, and so on and so forth. And within 18 months, I was the state president. And that's a story in itself, it's all here. And anyway, I'd done a lot of things. I joined the AMA, got active in the AMA for the wrong reasons, but then I discovered how power can be used in certain ways to give effect to the aspirations of people that don't have any. And in 1989, I met a man that changed my life. There was a man called Dr. Bruce Shepherd, who was described in the British Medical Journal as an avuncular, ultra-right-wing orthopaedic surgeon from Sydney. Now, Bruce was deeply offended when they published that, because he said he was far more right-wing than the description journey. So anyway, in 1989, Bruce is running around the country raising money to fight the government, a fighting fund for the medical profession, and I went along to this big meeting in Hobart, and a friend of mine said, "I'll introduce you to Bruce," and I said, "Well, that wouldn't be a good idea." So anyway, I went up to him and I said, "How do you do, Dr. Shepherd? You represent everything in the medical profession I don't like. You've given us a particularly bad name. I'm on a reform agenda, and I'm going to do everything I can to marginalise you and people like you." Now, he looked at me and I thought he'd say two words, the first of which would be "get." Instead, he said, "I've been watching you." He said, "You're going to go a long way, and the medical profession desperately needs people like you." He said, "When you get to know me, then tell me what you think about me." He said, "The first piece of advice I'm going to give you is never pass an opinion on someone you've never met." I was quite disarmed by all of that, and amongst the things that had brought me to his attention, that I doubled the membership of the AMA in 12 months in Tasmania, and I'd also steadfastly fought publicly a group of people corporatising medical services in Tasmania, and I'd sustained death threats and all sorts of things. The person who was doing it went to jail, I might add. But I'd kept at it, and Bruce Shepherd admired that, even though he and I were poles apart in a few things. So I had the privilege to get to know Bruce Shepherd, who became a mentor and very much a friend. And when I had become the national president of the AMA, I articulated the vision for the AMA. What differentiates leadership from management is vision. And then you focus on people, policy and programs and a variety of other things. And I was reforming the bureaucracy within the AMA. And I had my doubts about somebody, and I rang Bruce Shepherd and I said, "What's your view of this person?" He said, "He's never bled for anything." I said, "I beg your pardon, Bruce?" He said, "He's never fought for anything." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "In life you have to surround yourself with people possessed of two qualities. The first is you've got to find people who believe in something enough that they'll bleed for it." He said, "Whether you share their cause is less important than they actually have something they care about enough to bleed for." He said he's never done that. He said the second quality you've got to look for, you've got to find people that are over-enthusiastic. Much better, he said, to hose people down a couple of times a day than stick ginger up their bums to get them moving. So anyway, when I'd been the president of the AMA for 2 years, and it was Alexander Downer, when he was leader of the Liberal Party, that approached me and asked me if I would consider running for Parliament, and this is all documented. And he didn't like Steele Hall, who was the former Liberal leader in South Australia, who'd gone off as an independent, and Steele Hall was the member for Boothby. And Alexander Downer saw me as someone who might be able to displace Steele Hall. I'd lived in Boothby in Adelaide for 9 years. And I said to him, I said, "No, I'm sorry, I'm not interested. Thank you very much. I've got AMA leadership, I've got my medical practice, so I'm sorry, I'm flat out doing these other things." And then things went from bad to worse for Mr. Downer, and in late 1994, for those of you who may remember, there was some serious thought that Paul Keating might be elected again. So I made the decision that I wouldn't get any more done unless I actually got into Parliament myself, and then I moved to Sydney and successfully challenged David Connolly, who'd been the member for Bradfield for 21 years, and a very nice man, but in my opinion quite ineffectual. And I thought I'd been practising medicine in public housing estates and blue-collar suburbs. I knew what the politicians did, getting the pension checks to turn up, the power turned back on, and all of the things that are so critically important. But I had a particular interest also in where the country was going. And it was pretty simple. I'd never lived in Bradfield. In fact, initially I had a look at North Sydney. It took me 3 days to find out a guy called Joe Hockey had spent 3 years stacking all the branches and had no chance. And it was Bruce Shepherd's assistant, Anne Smith, who said, "Well, what about the next one up the road, Bradfield?" She said, they're quite different up there. They've got a nice man up there, but he's not very effective, but they seem to like it up there. And so it was as simple as, it wasn't simple, but I document in the book, by the way, something that happened during that pre-selection, and understandably, David and his supporters were steadfast in their resistance to me, and all sorts of methods were used to frustrate my ambitions. But in the course of that, I received a phone call from Stephen Smith. I didn't know Stephen Smith. He was the General Secretary of the Western Australian branch of the Australian Labor Party. And at the time, my brother was in hospital dying from AIDS. And Stephen Smith rang me and introduced himself, and he said, I understand you have a brother that's sick. And I said, yes, I do. He said, I've got some material here that's been given to me which relates to the circumstances in which your brother's acquired his illness. I said, oh, okay. He said, I just want you to know I've destroyed it. He said, it's come from your side. He said, I don't trade in this sort of thing. And I realised, following the conversation, that I'd just met a good man who would become and was a political adversary nonetheless. But I admired that. And unfortunately, we don't have enough of that in our public discourse these days. There are lots of things that I could talk to you about in the book. I've named the chapters. The chapters are, the titles come from things that people have said in different parts of the chapter. So one of the chapters in education it comes from a letter that a 7-year-old wrote to me. So 2005, and I'm Minister for Education, Science and Training. I go along to the Highfields Preparatory School in my long-suffering electorate of Bradfield in West Linfield. So preps to year 2s. It was the 50th anniversary, and I officially opened a new library. So I do what ministers do, and then about 3 weeks later I get 30 letters from the year 2s. One of them from a then 7-year-old, James Rowe. Dear Dr. Nelson, thanks for turning up at our school. You didn't have to come, we already had the key. Then he says, you're a real comedian, but your speech was long. I had a cat called Nelson, but he died. And there's a drawing of a cat in extremis, so I framed it and hung it on the wall of my office. And then about 3 months later, I'm on a flight from Perth to Sydney, and I get up at one point to go to the bathroom. The pilot simultaneously comes from the cockpit with the same objective, so I'll step back to let him in. He said, I'll go after you. And I said, no, it's okay, I'll go after you. He said, no, you're far more important. You're my federal member of parliament. And I said, you're flying the plane, I'll go after you. And then he said, no, there's more. He said, you're my son's hero. And I didn't get a lot of that. And I said, oh, really? I said, how old is your son? He said, he's 7. I said, 7? Yes. He said, yes, he's got this enormous photograph of you on his bedroom wall. I said, really? And he said, yes, and next to it is a letter you wrote him. We framed it. I asked, what did I write to him about? He said, you wrote him the most moving bereavement letter. He had a much-loved cat called Nelson who died. So I had a cat called Nelson, but he died, is one of the chapters. I'd become Minister for Defence, and I was at my very first meeting with the Chief of the Australian Defence Force, Sir Angus Houston, and Rick Smith, who was then the Secretary of the Department of Defence. So it's a 1-hour meeting. We're getting briefed on the operations. We were in 10 operations then: Afghanistan, Iraq, Solomon Islands, East Timor and 6 others. Huge decisions that had to be made. What are the priorities for the budget, for the Expenditure Review Committee, a whole range of things. So at the end of the meeting, the Secretary, Rick Smith, leans over, and he seriously had the look of a man bearing the weight of the world. And he said, Minister, the only thing I can guarantee you is we will let you down. When they left, I turned to my Chief of Staff and I said, what do you think he meant by that? It only took me 5 days to find out. I go through all of those sort of experiences and others, some good, some not so. The decision to bypass and override defence and buy 24 Super Hornets. The decision to override the Chief of Navy and John Howard to buy the Navantia-designed air warfare destroyers and a few other things that we did. Just in terms of, before concluding, because I know you don't want to be here all night, but there are just a couple of things I'll just relate to you in terms of my experiences with John Howard. In 1996, as you well recall, only weeks after the election of the Howard government, we had the Port Arthur massacre. Gun control for me was an easy issue. I had campaigned for it as president of the AMA. I represented the people of Bradfield in the upper North Shore of Sydney. It was an easy issue for me. But for about 30% of our party room, it was an extraordinarily difficult issue, and for the National Party. So there'd been 2 weeks of intense, searing debate about gun control. And so we finally got to our party room meeting after the massacre, and I thought, I was newly elected, I thought this is going to be interesting. John Howard stood up in front of the party room and he said, "What I'm about to say to you is contrary to everything I've ever believed." He said, "We're going to have to pass laws to control the lives of people that have never done anything wrong and never will. We're going to have to tell the states what to do, and if they won't do it, we're going to have to find a constitutional way to get around them. But in my 23 years in public life, I've never been more convinced that this is the right thing to do." And I thought to myself at the time, whether one agreed or disagreed with what the government did, I thought that's leadership. Standing up to your base. It's one thing for us to go out, as Amanda has done so admirably, and fight our political opponents, but it's quite another to stand up to your own most loyal supporters in your base and tell them that you've got to do something else. My experiences with John Howard also included, after the 2001 election, I had been Parliamentary Secretary for Defence for a year. And I'd looked after the Defence Estate, cadets, Defence IT, emergency management, a whole bunch of other things. And after the election, John Howard called me and asked me if I would go into Cabinet as Minister for Education, Science and Training. And of course I was speechless, but of course I said yes. And he said, "Brendan, while I'm speaking to you, there's a couple of things I'd like to say to you." He said, after the 1998 election, he said, "You would have noticed that 2 of your colleagues in New South Wales got promoted and you didn't, Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey." And I said, "Yes, Prime Minister." He said, "Well, then I gave you the worst job I've ever given anyone." And he said, "I made you the chairman of that Sydney Airport Community Forum to design and implement the noise abatement procedures at Sydney Airport." And I said, "Yes." He said, "You must have been disappointed and you were probably angry." And I said, "Yes, I was both, actually." He said, "But what I admire is you just threw yourself into it and nobody had any idea that's how you felt." He said, "I've had a few disappointments in my life." That's an understatement. He said, "How people deal with those says more about them than how they deal with success." And the second thing he said, "You and I have different views on some issues." He said, "I want you to bring your views to the Cabinet. I don't want you to feel intimidated to not say what you really think and believe, even if it's something that I disagree with you on." And again, to me, that is leadership. Then in 2004 election campaign, we were 6 days out from election day. I just flown into Launceston, and I was Education, Science and Training Minister, and I had to speak to a big dinner in Launceston that night. And I was just about to leave my hotel room, and my mother called from Adelaide to say my father had just died. And I sat down on the bed for 10 minutes or so, just trying to get myself together. I couldn't get out of Launceston. There was no point anyway. What could I do? I just rang Rhonda Van Zeller, who ran my electorate office and my Bradfield campaign, and I just let her know I had to speak to somebody. So I did the dinner. No one had any idea what had happened. It was just after midnight. I just got to sleep. And here we are, it's the Sunday night or the early Monday morning, election day Saturday, my phone rings. It's John Howard. And he said, "Brendan, I understand your father died earlier tonight." And I said, "Yes." So he's on the phone for a full 10 minutes. Not about politics, not about the campaign, nothing like that. Talking to me about the death of his own father, the relationship he had with him. I discussed my relationship with mine, and so on and so forth. And then, so in 2006, when people in Bradfield were saying to me, Brendan, look, Howard's got to go, we need Peter Costello, we've got to have a change, all that sort of stuff. They, and other reasons, is why I stayed with Howard to the very end. And in fact, in the book, I explained that in September 2007, at the APEC meeting, there was a big dinner at the Opera House on the Saturday night. And you may recall that Alexander Downer had famously called a meeting of all the cabinet ministers to find out whether we thought John Howard should go or not. And Peter Costello pulled me out of the canapes and the drinks, and we walked around the Opera House. And he said to me, he said, Brendan, I've been doing a bit of research. He said, you've got overwhelming support to be deputy leader of the party, and we've got to get Howard to go. And he said, what we can do is we can push the election out till March next year, reposition the government on a few things like the apology to forcibly remove generations of Aboriginal children, several other things. And I said to him, I said, look, okay, that sounds like an attractive proposition in one sense, but under no circumstances am I going to be party to removing John Howard from the Prime Ministership. I said, if John Howard decides himself he's going to go, then I would happily so serve you, but I'm not going to do that. And as you know, the rest of it's history. When I'll just finish on one other key event. When I I've got so many stories, it's hard to know which ones to tell you, but one thing I'll say to you is that when I became the leader of the Liberal Party, which was after that 2007 election, the biggest issue we had to deal with immediately, apart from the ambitions of another individual and other things, was this apology to forcibly remove generations of Aboriginal children. And when we were in government in 1997, when the Bringing Them Home report was released, there were 7 backbenchers who believed that we should apologise. I was one of them. And but the government made the decision that we would not do that, and that was accepted, certainly accepted by me. And so we had this apology, and for Labor it was easy in the sense that they all agreed with it, they had religious fervour on it. But for us it was much more difficult. About half of the party room at the time supported it. About 20% basically would go with the leadership, and we had 30% that were opposed to varying degrees, from ambivalence through to downright opposition. And it was a difficult issue. In the last 2 years we'd been in government, there was a lot of suppression of people expressing their views in the interest of discipline, that people were basically forced to not go out and cause any dissent or any undermining of the government solidarity. And my view was that we needed to have the party room meeting to have a discussion about this before we set ourselves onto a position on this. And one of the things that I'd learned through my life in terms of trying to get people where they don't want to go is they need to know that whoever leads them understands and respects their point of view. And so for pretty much for 6 to 8 weeks, I would constantly in the media, I was refusing to lock us in. Mr Turnbull would turn up like a Cheshire cat all the time, saying we had to do it, and I was hopeless because I wouldn't lock us in, and so on and so forth. And I felt the process of us getting there was as important as the final outcome. It seemed to me morally and politically wrong if we were not to support this. But we had to get to a position where the party room would basically accept the final outcome. And often I would be in the media saying, well, we're very proud of what those young Australians did at Gallipoli, but we are not responsible for having sent them there. We look back with a sense of shame at some of the things that were done in the removal of these children, but our generation is not responsible for them. And I knew in saying this that the Conservative members of our party especially, who were opposed to this, they knew that he gets it, that I understood their position and I respected it. And finally, when we had the meeting, which went for 4 hours, I presented the for case, the against case, and I told them I very strongly recommended that we support it and why. And at the end of the meeting, Bill Heffernan, if you may recall Bill, the very earthy Junie farmer, senator from New South Wales, Bill stood up at the end of the meeting. He said, "I'm proud of the lot of yous. It's the best meeting I've ever attended." We lost 4 of them on the day, but it was without a doubt the best thing that we did. And I said to the party room at the time, I said, when I sit down to write my speech on Saturday, I actually wrote this speech, I said, every one of you will find something of what you think about this issue in what I say. And prior to the apology itself, I went up to the Cape again. I'd spent a lot of time in my life in Aboriginal communities. And I went up to the Cape and I spent 3 days up there in 4 communities, and I saw Noel Pearson. And I asked Noel Pearson, I said, "What's your attitude to the apology?" He said, "Look, I'm ambivalent about it." And he said, "I just think that white Australia is going to tick a box and then just go off and forget about the real problems." So on the plane back to Canberra, I resolved that when I spoke, I would do what I had done at the AMA, that I would not only support the apology on our behalf, but I'd also confront contemporary Australia with the real circumstances in which Aboriginal people find themselves today. At that time, it was the Little Children, a Sacred Report, and the violence perpetrated against women and children in Aboriginal communities. So I thought, well, if people are going to tune into this, they're going to hear some realities. So anyway, I was castigated for all of that. Just in finishing, when I was president of the AMA, the young doctors asked me if I'd go and speak to their annual conference about success. And I said to them, well, they were less than a decade younger than me, and I said to them, well, when you work it out, can you let me know? But now at the age of 64, I've got a better idea. The first is that good leaders, in my experience, are people that know what vision is about. You have to give people a comprehensive sense of where you're going, why you want to get there. You have to have a capacity to inspire people to rise above their own narrow self-interest and short horizon to support the broader interests of the organisation that you lead. You also have to have a sense of history. Trying to make sense of the world is hard enough, but it's absolutely essential to have a sense of history in doing so. That's why constantly drawing on the well of Robert Menzies and his writings and speeches is so critically important to the future of the Liberal Party. History is the way to make sense of a world that's very complex, and it also is a reminder that you have to make hard decisions and the consequences of making them. Good leaders, I also think, are clear-minded and ethical and decisive. They're motivated by a sense of public duty, and they're at ease with themselves. They're not full of their own self-aggrandisement. But to be successful, I've concluded, and I put this in the book as gratuitous advice to young people, the first is you have to have an open mind. You have to have a mind that is open to new ideas, to the unfamiliar, to people that are different. And, as Robert Menzies said in 1944, he said, "We took the name Liberal because we were determined to be a progressive party, prepared to experiment and in no way reactionary, but to always resist the socialist panacea." And the second thing is you nurture and protect the inner integrity of your intellect, your ability to think, to articulate ideas, to challenge the attitudes of others. And I say to young people, unless you can communicate effectively, whether it's to 5 people or 500, it's very hard to achieve your potential. You have to be interested in and interesting to the rest of the world. It's very easy to fall into the temptation of seeing the world through a straw. And especially in this age of algorithms, you can have your own inherent biases and prejudices reinforced 24/7, unless you work hard to see a broader context of political, social, cultural and business movements that are shaping the world in which you live and work. The third is character, about which Nick spoke. It derives from the Greek word, means the impression left in wax by a stone seal ring. The Greeks called it the stamp of personality. And as Nick quoted from the book, it makes or breaks people. The fourth is to be imbued with this imaginative capacity to see the world through the eyes of others. Almost all of life's suffering, pain and misery, in my experience, an observation comes from people who make themselves the centre of their own lives, absolutely incapable of understanding the world through the eyes of someone else. And the same may be said of nations, Mr. Putin being a good contemporary example. And the other thing is, as you get older, like when you're young, you're at 18th birthday parties, you're at 21st, you're at engagement parties, hens nights, bucks nights, weddings, divorce parties. And then as you get older, you find yourself at more and more funerals and memorial services. And you realise that in the end, people are not remembered for what they are. They're remembered for who they are and how they felt other people, how they made other people feel. Did they make others feel a reverence for themselves? And the great 17th century Prussian philosopher Immanuel Kant wrote that every human being is an end unto himself and not a means to be used by others. Respect for one's own humanity will be found in respect for the humanity of others, and morality is freedom. So I think, I hope that you'll enjoy reading the book. Lee Kernaghan said to me, he said he read it twice. I said, you need to get out there a bit more, mate. He said, I was inspired, I was deeply moved. On turning the last page, I realised my life had been enriched by reading Brendan's incredible journey. And my brother-in-law is the ag science teacher at Coral High School, and he's got pretty tough kids he has to teach. And he texted me a week after he took it, and he said, I cried, I laughed, I was inspired. He said, I took it to school and I read some of it to the kids, and he said you could hear a pin drop in the classroom. And John Howard was very generous. Kim Beasley's been very generous in it, and some of it's banal and superficial. You know, I had a cat called Nelson, and similar things. And some of it's very deeply emotional. I've had a loaded gun pointed at me in my medical life. I've attended a 6-year-old whose mother's been complicit in the rape of the child by her partner. I've been assaulted by a dog. I've had a dog thrown at me. I've been stabbed with a hypodermic syringe. I've put a young woman into the back of an ambulance with endocarditis from her heroin addiction I thought I'd never see again. 5 years later, I saw her in Tasmania with a baby. Like all sorts of experiences like that. And but I think you'll find it of some value. So thank you, and now you may all relax.